Dew slicked the nettles along the sunken lane west of Bayeux, and the hedges held the diesel breath of a column that dared to believe in clouds. Hauptmann Karl Haydn checked his wristwatch against a paper march table laminated by handling and rain, then nodded to the Feldwebel at the head Opel Blitz. Low overcast pressed the wheat to a dull green and made the day feel narrower than it was. Haydn recited intervals, 25 to 30 kilometers per hour between junctions if the road stayed clear, and counted assets like a miser: 2 SID KFZs, 251 half-tracks carrying infantry, a run of trucks with spares and ammunition, and, too precious to lose, a fuel bowser with its camouflage smeared on by hand. From a break in the hedge bank, a farm girl watched with the patience of animals. Later she would learn to read the day by smell: cordite threaded through wet earth, hot rubber, spilled oil, but now she only noted damp canvas, clinking chains, and men who had borrowed her lane. A driver slid from a cab and stretched, counting his last cigarettes as if their number could lengthen the afternoon. "The clouds will keep us safe," the Feldwebel said, and several heads nodded because believing was easier than listening for engines that might be there and might not. The lane exhaled. Gearboxes ground. Canvas whispered. Haydn paced beside the bowser, timing the column's breathing, marking a bad culvert with a jab of the hand, rehearsing how he would clear a choke point if he had to. Hedgerows narrowed sightlines to a knife's length. A truck's world was the tailboard ahead and the ditch to the right. Haydn felt the map's weight in his breast pocket: arrows, timings, distances that existed only if the sky allowed them to exist. Panzer Lehr, the pride of mechanized infantry, wanted to bite at Caen. Biting required fuel and parts required lanes without thunder. At the next bend he raised 2 fingers and stretched the intervals, generous enough to feel safe, close enough to stay counted. Rain ticked on tarpaulins. The motorcycle scout went ahead with his muffler wrapped in oily rag, and the column's sound sank into the hedges until it became private thunder under green. A crow lifted, black against the lid of cloud. Men took it for a good sign, and superstition felt like strategy. From the orchard, the girl pressed her palm to damp stone as the bowser passed. She stood still to fix the smell in memory. The map, the table, the doctrine, everything depended on the cloud staying thick. Haydn looked up once, as if he might bargain with the sky, then kept the convoy moving. For the moment, daylight did not look back. Across the channel, the air smelled of Avgas and hot coffee. Lieutenant Jack Sawblade Mercer walked the leading edge of his P-47D Thunderbolt, palm-grazing aluminum warmed by a brief breath of sun. 8.50 caliber M2s blinked brass in their bays, belts fed inward like steel serpents. The crew chief read off the ritual: magnetos, fuel, pressures, while an armourer tapped a 500-pound general-purpose bomb with a knuckle, listening for the dull, healthy note. The Pratt & Whitney R280 coughed, then took hold. The sound was a factory's oath. In briefing, they had called it armed reconnaissance. Find the roads that mattered, break the bridges that stitched those roads together, and keep the enemy living at night. The board had squares scrawled with hand-drawn grids: Bayeux, Carentan, Saint-Lô, and a weather line that wavered like a heartbeat, marginal, lifting afternoon. A controller's voice, steady as a metronome, promised vectors to choke points and railway spurs. No one lingered over heroics. The talk was of angles, fusing, safe escape headings, and the way Bocage forced convoys into files you could cut like cloth. Mercer climbed in, settled his shoulders, and felt the seat's low familiarity. He had been a machinist before the war. Torque and tolerances had sent him to the sky as surely as wings had. He read the numbers like scripture. Top speed above 400, 8 Brownings delivering roughly 100 rounds a second, typical D-Day load 2500S, and a centerline tank, with rockets appearing more often every week. Abundance made the hard stand feel inevitable. Pallets of fuses, pyramids of fuel drums, spare engines crated like fruit. Taxi, run-up. The prop blurred into a silver disc. On the perimeter track, a line of jugs rolled with the patient gravity of freight trains. Mercer imagined the road net across the water as a set of arteries the squadron would cauterize. He thought of trucks he would never see again once smoke closed around them, of men he would never meet who would live because a bridge did not. The controller broke in, ceiling lifting over the Cotentin, wind steady, proceed to departure point, and the flight answered like a choir. At the runway's edge, the crew chief held up a gloved fist, then opened it. Mercer pushed the throttle forward, felt the tail rise and the runway come to him, and let the jug have the day. The wheels thumped up. France waited under a lid the sun was already prying open. Unteroffizier Dieter Rauch lifted into the pale and hunted the seam where cloud met light. From up here the channel looked like molten tin beaten flat by a nation of hammers. Ships stippled the horizon in such numbers that the scene felt like a mistake in arithmetic. Rauch had trained for duels, angles into angles, a flash of tracer, a 4-second burst, and instead found a sky that seemed crowded even when empty. Fuel was short, spares were shorter, and his orders were a gesture. Patrol this sector, keep the enemy honest, report what you see. Below the cloud, Normandy was a patchwork of lanes stitched by hedges. He glimpsed movement and flak, friendly 20s probing the mist in uncertain bursts, and then nothing. The radio crackled with clipped syllables, call signs without comfort. He dipped a wing toward a column diced by sunken lanes and thought, not for the first time, that ground war was a stranger's problem until you watched it burn. Over Carentan, a contrail curved like a question mark and vanished. He climbed into emptiness to live another minute. On the ground, the farm girl, Henriette, called Hetty, walked the edge of an orchard and counted sounds. Engines, metal on metal, a driver cursing a wet match, the scrape of a jack under an axle. She could not name units, but she understood consequence. Every road that connected her world to the sea now worried the men who used it. The air felt charged, as if a storm were choosing a field. Rauch popped back into thin light and saw it at last. Thunderbolts sliding beneath the lid as if the clouds were a ceiling they owned the keys to. He watched a pair roll toward a lane, saw dirt jump in precise rectangles, and felt the sick weight of math as smoke dragged itself into the hedges. He called it in, position, heading, numbers, and got no answer that helped. The temptation to dive after them tugged his gut, but doctrine and fuel needle said no. Live and report. Live and watch. The impossible truth formed with the smoke. On this day, the enemy would fly thousands of sorties while his own side might scratch a few hundred. It was not just pilots, it was factories, fuel, radios, and the quiet confidence to spend them. Rauch levelled, lonely in a sky that belonged to someone else, and turned for base before the gauge humiliated him. Below, a convoy crept, and daylight sharpened its teeth. The overcast frayed like gauze above the Bayeux-Carentan road, and daylight slipped a blade between hedge and ditch. Mercer came in under the lid with the jug shouldering the air like a brawler in a narrow hallway, the slipstream fingering clipped hedge tops. The first convoy appeared as a geometry lesson, rectangles of canvas, a cylinder of a Bowser, the squared shoulders of half-tracks, and the lesson's answer was measured in milliseconds. He eased to a 40-degree dive, sight dancing, and pressed the trigger. 8 Brownings spoke at once, a ripping of linen magnified to cathedral size, and Tracer stitched the lane until dirt jumped like fleas off a dog. He pickled one 500-pounder a heartbeat later. The bomb stepped into the lead truck and turned the road into splinters and black breath. Flack woke late and angry. The 20s and 30s hammered their metronomes, black puffs and dirty strings at the edges of his vision, but the jug's weight and speed carried him through. He rolled level, skimming tree height, and saw the pattern he had been briefed to see. A column funneled by bocage was not a set of vehicles. It was a single organism with a spine you could break. He widened and came back from the sun. The second pass was lower, closer, crueler. Rounds tore canvas. A Bowser belched flame and became a shrine to heat. Hayden's world shrank to the length of the tailboard ahead. The march table in his pocket felt like a joke the sky had told on him. He shouted to the flak team, and their 2-centimetre clattered up, barrel smoking after 100 rounds that found nothing but air and nerve. He felt the heat of the Bowser on his cheek and realised with stale clarity that every kilometre achieved in daylight would have to be paid back at night with interest. Doctrine, timing, converging attacks, all of it presupposed roads that were safe corridors. The air had repossessed them. Mercer pulled to the deck and ran out his escape heading, counting seconds to the tree line as if counting beads. Behind him the road drew veils of smoke across itself, hiding what still lived. He glanced at the fuel, at the arming switch, and at the second 500 that hung patient and dumb under his wing. There were more bridges than bombs, more trucks than his lifetime could address, but the controller's voice made that arithmetic bearable. Next grid, next choke, next cut. He banked toward it. The gap in the clouds widened like a grin. The controller's voice braided squadrons into a single fabric. Proceed 250 to the stone bridge west of St. Lo. Traffic dense. Flak light to moderate. Mercer acknowledged and felt the machine of 9th Tactical Air Command turn under his hands, a loom working threads into knots that would hold until night. He made the bridge by its shadow first, then by the glint of pooled water where shell holes collected the afternoon. The first pair strafed, the second pair dropped. Stone leapt and sagged. Vehicles concertinaed into their own obstacles, and suddenly the problem wasn't how many trucks to kill, but how much time to erase. He landed, taxied through a colonnade of fuel drums, and watched ground crews turn violence into ritual. Belts snaked back into wings, bomb hoists creaked. A crew chief's pencil scratched fuel figures on a grease-smudged clipboard. The numbers sounded like scripture. 2 500s again. Full internal fuel. Keep the centerline tank if the controller needs a longer leash. A chaplain walked the hard stand the way a medic walks a line of cots, soft words and nods for men whose hands still shook long after the throttle came idle. There were empty chairs in the briefing shack, but the board outside had already shifted taskings to cover the holes, and abundance made morning efficient. Back over the bocage, Mercer rolled into a shallow dive and watched the geometry of interdiction explain itself a second time. You didn't have to kill everything. Collapse a bridge, gut the lead vehicles, and the column behind becomes a cattle chute of fear. He keyed the mic. Bridge gone. Secondary traffic stacking. Recommend third element, cut the culvert on the lateral. The controller's calm reply barely needed words. He had other aircraft coiled for just that cut, and within minutes the lateral choked too. If the morning had belonged to weather, the afternoon belonged to the net. Hetty dragged a driver into orchard shade and wrapped a bandage with torn linen that would stain forever. She watched smoke climb carefully around hedges and listened for the difference between .50 caliber rip and cannon cough. The orchard smelled of apples bruised by concussion, hot rubber, cordite, damp soil. War's vocabulary wrote itself into her nose. On his next pass, Mercer held fire, counting flak rhythms and imagining the gunner's arc like an engineer marking a swing. He pickled clean and felt the jug lift empty, lighter by 500 earnests. The bridge exhaled dust and then settled, defeated in a way stone seldom is. Choke point closed, the controller said, as if he were reporting the weather. Proceed to next tasking. Mercer turned and saw the afternoon flatten into a schedule he trusted more than luck. Rauch watched from above as if he were condemned to witness his own army's breath being stolen one lung at a time. He dipped a wing toward a road that writhed in smoke and saw half-tracks trying to reverse into hedges while drivers gestured wildly at one another with open hands, universal language for what do we do now. Hayden received the new order in a commandeered farmhouse where the wallpaper still clung to one stubborn corner. No road movement by day. The words looked like doctrine, but they felt like surrender to physics. Dawn to dusk, the map was enemy country. He tried to argue for exceptions, short dashes across open ground, a run to a vital junction, and staff officers, grey with fatigue, pointed him to a growing ledger of losses. Bowser, radio truck, half-track. The column's motor nerves had been cut. It didn't matter how many panthers prowled in the tree line if their fuel lay black and hissing 30 kilometres behind. A 2-centimetre crew outside kept the barrel on safe and smoked without speaking. They had fired 2 ammunition chests that afternoon, probably 400 rounds, and hit nothing but courage. In the air, Mercer flew another cycle and then another. The group's butcher's bill of expenditure began to sound indecent. Scores of tons of ordnance dropped in hours. Tens of thousands of .50 caliber rounds poured through hedges into canvas and rubber and will. At scale, the arithmetic stopped being romantic and started being civic. This was a republic spending its inventory of metal to buy an infantryman an hour, then another. Near Carentan, a P-47 limped home with flak freckles stitched across her belly. The crew would drill out the damaged skin and rivet on fresh sheet before dawn, like tailors refitting a favourite coat. Rauch called in what he saw and received nothing a fighter pilot wants, acknowledgements without remedy. On paper, the Luftwaffe would fly hundreds of sorties over the lodgement that week. The enemy would fly thousands in single days when the ceiling cleared. The gulf between the numbers could fit armies inside it. He stayed high because fuel and caution said so, and because diving into that racket felt like leaping into a machine designed to grind hopeful men into lessons. Haydn took a pencil and circled dusk on the march table, as if emphasis could bend the sun's schedule. Around the farmhouse, the day rang with distant engines and occasional strikes that raised brief pillars of dust. He closed his eyes and saw bridges collapsing as if pushed by an invisible hand. He opened them to the unkind optimism of 5 more hours of light. Dusk poured into the lanes and made the hedges kind again. Haydn released the brake with a breath he didn't know he had been holding all day, and the column slid into motion like a rumour that hoped not to be heard. Canvas flapped softly. Lights hid in slitted hoods. Men spoke in syllables cut thin enough to pass for leaves moving. The first crossroads had been cratered by yesterday's attentions. They took a farm track that existed on no map, its ruts filled with reflected sky. Engines laboured in low gear, heat building in machinery that wanted speed more than it wanted stealth. At one bend, a truck took too wide a bite and kissed the ditch. There was no heavy wrecker left. Men and curses did the lifting. 10 minutes became 40. The lane smelled of hot brakes and damp dirt. Haydn moved among them, a careful energy that made mistakes feel like treason. Somewhere to the east, a single aircraft droned, and men flattened themselves without thinking, the way animals learn a storm's grammar. The drone receded. A driver crossed himself. A corporal laughed too loudly at nothing. They made only a handful of kilometres before a culvert, invisible in the dark, collapsed under the Bowser's weight. Fuel spread like a sin. The quiet became an argument. Haydn ordered cans stacked, a forward trickle carried by men whose shoulders would remember the hour forever. Night was not a blessing, but a loan, and dawn would come to collect. Near first light, they reached a copse that looked like respite and slid under it, engines ticking down to silence. Men lay where they stepped and dreamed of daylight that didn't hunt. At altitude, Mercer took a first light run along habitual paths, the jug tasting air as if it were water poured over an anvil. He'd learned the tells of night movement, a track bright where dew had been wiped away, a glint where condensation clung to canvas seams, smoke that didn't belong to kitchens. He cut power and let the lane reveal itself, a magician showing the audience his empty hands before pulling fear from behind their ears. Haydn heard the engine before he felt the heat. The first rounds plucked at leaves and canvas, and then found steel. He couldn't move. The lesson from yesterday had been learned. Hands clenched, teeth worked. No one breathed until the sound went away, and when it finally did, the men exhaled together like bellows. Dawn had made its point. Back at the airfield, abundance wore the face of routine. Pallets of bombs squatted like captured fortresses. Fuel drums stood in ranks so precise they seemed to practice drill. Mercer taxied past a new shipment of propellers, their tips still in paper socks, and thought of the town where someone's midnight shift shaped each blade. The hard stand had its own seasons. Briefing, start, strike, land, turnaround. Eat if you can. Write a letter if you must. Go again. The ground crews were the quiet weather that made the day possible, hands so fast that damage felt temporary and hunger an inconvenience. He walked past a row of jugs with cowling panels open like surgeon's notes and read the chalked tallies, bridges, trucks, rails. A bomb truck rattled by, another pair of 500s duking on their hooks. He remembered the first time he'd been given permission to spend a bomb on a single truck if it held a choke point and had smiled at the impiety of it. Waste was a peacetime word. Here, waste was a weapon, and American industry baptized it daily. 2 500s on a culvert might save 2 platoons. 10,000 .50 caliber rounds in an afternoon might be cheaper than a single day of enemy freedom to move. The mess tent smelled of coffee that had boiled too hard and of bacon sacrificed to efficiency. A chaplain folded notes and a medic dozed with his head on a crate of tourniquets. Mercer ate without tasting and watched an armourer restack belts with the calm of a librarian shelving dangerous books. Out on the line, a replacement jug arrived and was swallowed whole by the machine. Serial noted, quirks annotated, ammunition harmonised, a pilot fitted like a new part. He thought of factories with names like Evansville and Farmingdale, and of how their rhythms echoed across lanes he had never seen. He briefed again. Same grids, new cautions. Flak ambushes were waking in hedgerow gaps. A jug had limped home with a hole you could hide a fist in. The controller asked for on-call loiter and hinted that infantry were learning to ask for thunder the way farmers ask for rain. Mercer strapped in, not to play hero but to connect the factory to the hedgerow again, as many times as the clock allowed. He looked down the runway and saw the day not as hours, but as tonnage waiting to be converted into minutes of safety for men he would never meet. He gave it throttle. The infantry platoon on the lateral road had learned a new verb, to vector. They'd been taught to speak a grid square clearly, to mark smoke where needed, and to trust that metal would arrive before their fear curdled. Mercer orbited at 10,000 with the centerline tank still feeding, waiting for the controller's handoff. The call came as a request shaped like a prayer. Enemy block at the culvert, armor noise behind it, daylight threatening to turn into a corridor for someone else's courage. He rolled, bled altitude, and flattened into the approach like a craftsman setting a plane on oak. The first pass wasn't a kill, it was a correction. He walked the .5s along the verge where heads might pop up, then pickled a single 500 short of the culvert to slide the blast under it. Dirt leapt, water and stone made a thick cough. The platoon sergeant, face streaked with dust and disbelief, said, "Thank you," into a handset as if addressing weather. Mercer answered with a wing wag and came back for the second 500, this time to make the fix permanent. The culvert collapsed with a reluctant shrug, and the road died in both directions. Flak learned fast. A 20mm belt opened from a hedgerow he hadn't marked, muzzle flashes like red seeds in green. The jug shook and kept flying, the radial an anvil with a propeller. He pulled up and felt for damage, tested controls, found everything still obedient, and decided he'd pay the gunner back on his last pass with a walking burst that would saw his cover down to an honest stump. Radios braided gratitude and new requests. He could hear in the voices the future, on call, immediate, a sky that could be pointed like a finger. Rauch, listening to fragments in a ready room that smelled of damp leather and old tobacco, mapped a different future. If the enemy could hover thunder over a platoon and assign it a task like artillery with wings, then daylight was not only dangerous, it was intelligent. He had believed battles belonged to those who mastered tactics. He began to suspect they belonged to those who mastered schedules. In the time it took Haydn to crawl 5 kilometers in darkness the previous night, American depots had pushed ashore thousands of tons, more in those hours than his division would see in a month. The scale felt like a rumour from a giant's country. Mercer turned for home with one more story for the crew chief. A close pass, a lesson learned, a lane denied until moonrise. The operational research team moved across the verge like solemn gardeners, tape measures and notebooks replacing rifles. They counted what war left behind, hulls with their decks peeled, trucks that had burned down to the wisdom of their frames, boots that remembered feet. One man knelt at a culvert and traced a crack in stone the way a surgeon might palpate a chest. The collapse had severed a company's afternoon as cleanly as a scalpel. Another sketched the angle of strafing runs by the way hedges were combed in one direction more than another. Truth lay in the debris if you asked in the right language. They tallied claims against confirmations with the detachment of accountants who know grief sits behind every number. Fewer tanks had died under bombs and rockets than pilots believed, that much was certain. However, the trucks and fuelers and radios, the harmless-looking organs, had perished in rates that bruised the mind. A single burned Bowser at the wrong bend could starve a battalion. A collapsed bridge turned an entire regiment into an argument with a map. The P-47's 8 Brownings, not glorious rockets, had often done the day's most decisive work, tearing rubber, canvas and nerve. Mercer walked with them in the afternoon and listened without defensiveness. He pointed to scorch patterns that matched his habits and to scars he knew belonged to someone else's. He said, likely, and would have, when memory and record met and found they had been standing at different angles to the same event. He rested a hand on a shattered road sign and thought of his wingman's empty chair, of letters finished by someone who was not him. Numbers were not absolution. They were understanding, the only kind the dead could still use. Haydn read his own research in a staff report that might as well have been a confession. Losses by category. Causes guessed at with the charm of official phrasing. He wrote 2 notes in the margin. Bridges and fuel. Underlined them twice. It did not matter that his panthers had survived the week. They were animals without a habitat. The team's lead closed his notebook. It wasn't the tanks, he said, not to diminish heroics but to calibrate them. It was the time. They had not incinerated the enemy's fist, they had paralysed his wrist. The conclusion felt less cinematic than the legends would prefer and far more devastating. Afternoon leaned toward evening. Somewhere a tractor started in a field that would outlive them all. The phrase moved from rumour to doctrine in German logs as June deepened. No road movement by day. Rommel, who had argued to keep armour close to the beaches precisely because he feared this, now read reports that made his caution look like prophecy and impotence at once. Klug's staff spoke in arithmetic. Counter-attacks scheduled for afternoon arrived at midnight or not at all. Opportunities shrank from hours to minutes and then to regrets. Panzerlehr's ledger listed not glorious duels, but attrition of lifeblood, fuel Bowsers, half-tracks, radio vans, the prosaic vehicles without which teeth could not bite. Across the lodgement, the Allied beachhead swelled by the day in a way that felt indecent to anyone who had not watched American towns become factories. By the end of the month, there were on the order of 850,000 men ashore, around 150,000 vehicles, and more than 500,000 tons of supplies, stacks of crates that made barns look shy. Daylight belonged to them. Convoys moved at noon without apology. Engineers built roads while eating sandwiches. A platoon could ask the sky for thunder and receive it soon enough to feel lucky. Rauch flew fewer sorties and wrote more reports. He chose words the way a bitter man chooses silences. The pilots left could still fight. The aircraft left could still climb. The problem was a calendar he did not own. He thought of daylight as a currency he no longer carried, and of the indignity of borrowing it on nights that grew shorter and shorter. Pride became a private animal he fed in small, guilty bites. Hetty measured the new world with work. She drew water for men whose accents made "thank you" a stitched smile, and she stacked apples without thinking, only to jump when an engine note fell suddenly near. She knew to wait 2 breaths before going to help. 1 breath was too soon and might become 2 lives instead of 1. Mercer strapped in each morning expecting routine and finding instead the respectful strangeness of success. Fewer targets close, more taskings deep, bridges to break that were already cracked by someone else's hand. He felt the war tip. The sky did not empty of danger, but it filled with habit. The controller's voice sounded like a good road, even, predictable, taking you where you meant to go. At sunset, Hetty watched contrails draw white veins into a blue that hadn't belonged to her yesterday. Below, a silent German column waited for night to legalize existence. Above, American trucks rolled in honest daylight, audaciously ordinary. The meaning needed no interpreter. Weeks later, the hedgerows browned along their tips, and the lanes remembered tires the way skin remembers rings. Mercer walked to his jug with the measured gratitude of a man who had found a rhythm and kept it without breaking. He touched the cowling once for friends who had not, then strapped in and felt the familiar weight of a nation gather in his shoulders. He thought of Evansville, where thousands of jugs had been borne by hands that had learned to make speed, and of the way an assembly line could reach across an ocean and lay its palm on a French lane. Haydn burned papers by a ditch, not to hide guilt, but to warm fingers that had learned too much about maps. He could still count his panthers and feel pride. He could not replace the trucks that had fed them. Rauch folded orders into a pocket and stared at a horizon where the sky had become an opinion he could not argue with. Hetty stacked apples in a basket lined with a towel mended too many times and set beside it a jar of shell splinters she had promised herself she would throw away someday. The statistics that would live in books felt like folklore made literal. In a single month, the Allies had landed more men, more vehicles, more tonnage than seemed possible for any coastline to bear. On days when weather opened, a single P-47 group could drop scores of tons and fire tens of thousands of rounds, more metal through the air in an afternoon than some enemies managed to allocate in weeks. The Luftwaffe bled hundreds of aircraft in the west in June and ended the month with fighter numbers that could not remake a sky. Impossible had become routine. Mercer taxied, tipped a wing to the crew chief, and rolled into a morning that did not need to be stolen. He understood now that the Thunderbolts' real victory was not the dramatic cooking off of a tank, but the quiet, repeated erasure of hours from an enemy's calendar. The arsenal had become a tactic. The factory had learned to write its signature on a road. American democracy had weaponized abundance without apology, and then used it to make ordinary soldiers' lives longer by minutes that added up to a world. He lifted, turned toward the grids that still required repair, and felt the jug's big heart settle into its work. Day belongs to us, he thought, not as a boast but as a statement of maintenance, and climbed into a sky held up by hands he would never shake.